When we start with a new medication, we often start with sort of baby steps. And so the dream is that, you're 50, you're 60, you've accumulated enough of these senescent cells that it's worth taking a senolytic drug and clearing them out and effectively staving off the aging process for some number of years, perhaps, if we're lucky.
Seniority Authority exists to answer your questions on aging. The world has changed dramatically in a generation, with more retirees than ever before, living longer, with more choices. If you're an older adult or have an older adult in your life, where do you go to begin to understand those choices? I'm your host, Cathleen Toomey, with over a decade of work experience in retirement communities. I can track down the right people to answer your questions. So send your questions on aging to me, and together, let's get smarter about growing older. What if we could grow older without experiencing the physical and mental decline that we associate with aging? Would you believe there's research going on right now to examine how we can take what we know about our DNA and biology and reduce or eliminate some of the more painful hallmarks of aging? Stay tuned to hear the latest on how we might become ageless in the future. Thanks to our show sponsor, the Riverwoods Group, Northern New England's largest family of nonprofit retirement communities, where active adults find community, purpose, and peace of mind. Visit riverwoodsgroup.org. Now let's hear from today's guest. Welcome to Seniority Authority. I'm your host, Kathleen Toomey. Can you imagine how our lives might change if we could eliminate aging? Not simply the diseases that aging brings, but the actual molecular process of aging that we all experience. Sounds like sci-fi, right? Something out of Kurt Vonnegut or Ray Bradbury. But it's not a sci-fi writer that's exploring this, but a computational biologist and science writer based in London, who has a best-selling book, Ageless, that came out this year. Dr. Andrew Steele received his Ph.D. in physics from the University of Oxford before deciding that he would turn his attention to the most significant medical challenge of our time, aging. Welcome to Seniority Authority, Dr. Steele.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on the program, and I am so fascinated by this book, which I dove into. But let's talk about you first. Let's talk about what first drew you to this field of study. It wasn't a heart-rending tale of loss, but it was a graph. Is that correct?
Yeah, I often tell people, I'm being slightly glib when I do so, but only very slightly, that I changed career because of a graph. And exactly as you said in the intro, I started out as a physicist. You can imagine my whole training, it's been a lot of maths, a lot of science. I've got a very numerical, statistical view of the world. And the graph was simply the graph of how likely you are to die, depending on how old you are. So let's sort of deconstruct what that looks like. I'm in my 30s right now. So that means that I've got a risk of death about 1 in 1,000 every year. So, got a 1 in 1,000 chance of not making my next birthday effectively. But as you get older, your risk of death doubles about every 8 years. And what that means is that by the time I'm 65, if nothing changes medically, my odds of death will be about 1% that year. And those still aren't bad odds. It's worth thinking. If you're 65 and your odds of death were to stay at 1% for the rest of your life, you'd live to be 165 on average. But clearly that isn't what happens. That doubling, by the time you've got 1%, that's a big enough number to start making a significant impact. So by the time you're 80, your odds of death are probably somewhere about 1 in 20 that year. And if you make it into your 90s, if you're lucky enough, then your odds of death are more like 1 in 6. So that's sort of life and death at the roll of a dice. And, you might look at that as a human being and just think, well, this is terrifying. I've got this exponential wall of mortality coming at me. But as a scientist, you look at that and you think, well, that's fascinating because we seem to have this incredibly synchronized change in risk of death. It happens across all people. And, why is it that we die? I think there's this myth that you can die of old age. You sort of go to bed one night and just don't wake up the next morning. It's all quite painless. But actually, the things that kill you, the cancer, the heart disease, the stroke, the dementia, all of these horrible diseases, they take years to sap away your independence and eventually end up, becoming serious enough to end your life. So looking at it in that way, aging is the single biggest cause, I say in the book, of human suffering. Of the 150,000 people who die every single day all across the world, over 100,000 of them die because of diseases of aging. And so what that means is that, we've got this incredibly synchronized process. Maybe if we could throw a spanner into that process, if we could treat the aging process itself, we could save and improve an awful lot of lives. So that's what just, got me out of physics and into biology, basically.
That is fascinating. And what I love, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, is the very fact that you're focused on the aging process itself, not specifically the diseases. And we'll talk about why that's important politically. But why do we have new insights on aging today that we didn't have 40 years ago? And how does that make a computational biologist a good guide to analyze the aging process?
All sorts of stuff has changed in the last, in the last decade, in the last few decades. I think one of the really big factors is just general scientific progress. Something that we've all seen over the last 12 months is the incredible pace with which these mRNA vaccines were developed. So we went from understanding, a completely new virus, we'd never seen it before. We got its genetic code when we were able to turn that into vaccines in this incredibly short time. And that's effectively, standing on the shoulders of giants, as we often say in science, because we've got this understanding. We know, we now know the structure of DNA. Not only do we know that, we can sequence the DNA of a human being in an afternoon for about $1,000. The first human genome we sequenced back in 2001. It was a decade-long project that cost billions, and yet now, you can send off and have your DNA sequenced online. And so all of this sort of combination of different things means that we're in a much stronger position scientifically in a whole load of different ways. In the book, it's obviously it's a bit facile in some ways to try and characterize the start of a specific scientific field, because these things are all sort of constantly shifting and moving and changing. But I try and talk about the start of biogerontology, the study of the biology of the aging process, as being somewhere in the 1990s. To sort of go from being a sort of strange pastime that a few scientists are doing into a much more mainstream bit of science. And that's because there were these discoveries that were made in the 80s and 90s that showed you could change a single letter of a worm's genetic code. And a worm might seem a strange place to start, but they're a classic organism that's used in science. They're much simpler than humans. And from an aging perspective, they're really important because they only live for about 2 weeks. So if you can do an experiment on these worms, you can churn through a few generations of worms in a few months. Whereas obviously if you're doing this with humans, trying to do this science, it might take you 80 or 90 years, maybe even longer if it works, in the unfortunate case that your experiment succeeds. And so these worms, you're able to double their lifespan just by changing a single letter of their DNA. And I think what this really did was it showed that this wasn't some incredibly complicated process. Scientists before the 90s thought that aging was just some irreducibly complex, inevitable process of decay. But now, by changing a single letter, you could double a worm's lifespan. And what that means is that suddenly, not only is this incredibly exciting, it shows that aging can be changed, but also it means that you can do these experiments in the lab. You can use the tools of genetics. You can use the molecular biology that was really starting to develop around that time and really drill into what the aging process is. And to answer the final bit of your question, this is sort of why, a computational biologist might be a good guide to this stuff, because biology is really moving from, being a bunch of, people in the lab dripping stuff on cells in a dish, a load of transparent liquids and people looking down microscopes. These things are all still really important, by the way. We need our wet lab biologists. But what they're doing is they're generating more and more data than ever before because of things like that DNA sequencing. They're generating, gigabytes and gigabytes, terabytes and terabytes of data that then needs to be analyzed by someone with sort of statistical and numerical skills. And that's the way that I managed to transition from physics to biology was by taking all that numeracy, all that programming skill that I'd acquired as a physicist and turning it onto some of these enormous biological data sets. And I hope that's one of the ways that we're going to start to understand and tackle the aging process.
And that makes sense because we've never had this level of data before. And it's a totally different science to examine that data and figure out what makes sense. But it's not just the volume of data that we have that convinced you that this was something worth pursuing. Early on in your book, you reference a Galapagos tortoise. Tell our listeners why that's a symbol for you and what it says about aging and nature, the Galapagos tortoise.
Yeah, it's very easy to get caught up in sort of the allure of this really complicated science. And, you can drill into why is it that particular aspects of our biology cause the aging process, and maybe we can intervene, maybe we can do this, maybe we can do that. But I think the single most convincing example that shows us that aging isn't inevitable is that this is a problem that nature has solved loads of different times before. The reason there's a Galapagos tortoise on the cover of my book is because those Galapagos tortoises, they have a property called negligible senescence, which is just a scientific way of saying not very much, and then senescence is, of course, the biological term for aging. And what this means is, I said at the start that our risk of death doubles about every 8 years. Galapagos tortoise's rate of death, well, it doesn't double at all. It stays constant in its adulthood. It's about 1 or 2% a year, which is higher than a human's is for a lot of our young adulthood. What that means is they can live an incredibly long time. The oldest recorded Galapagos tortoise, we think, made it to about 175 years old.
Oh my gosh.
And what's more amazing than that isn't that she lived this incredibly, incredibly long time, although that's sort of cool in itself. What's exciting is because of the fact that her risk of death was basically constant with time, she effectively wasn't aging in the statistical sense. And in the more sort of biological everyday sense, she wasn't aging either, because tortoises don't get more frail as they get older. And obviously, tortoises, they start out wrinkly, they don't have any teeth, they're not exactly the fastest moving animals. So maybe they're not the best advocates, the best sort of symbols of anti-aging science. But she was probably pretty much as sprightly at 150 as she was at 50 years old. And so it's that sort of negligible senescence, that negligible increase in frailty, negligible decrease in, everything from eyesight to reproductive capacity, that I think is something we should be aspiring to as human beings.
Wow, that is fascinating. Okay, so we aspire to that lifespan, but not necessarily the wrinkles and the slow moving and the hard shell, perhaps. One of the things that I love about your book is it's breaks things down into reasonable chunks, and you discuss and group 10 hallmarks of aging, and one in particular is significant, which you just mentioned earlier, the accumulation of senescent cells, which are the aging cells. And this particular group you refer to as a smoking gun. Can you explain what those are and why that's important to the aging process?
The idea of these hallmarks of aging, which, as you say, I break down into 10 in the book, is that they're the fundamental cellular, molecular drivers of the aging process. So these are the things that cause us to age effectively. They cause everything from wrinkles to grey hair, to cancer, to cataracts, to the whole panoply of different things that go wrong with us. And so what's exciting is that if we can intervene in these processes, these hallmarks, rather than coming in, effectively fighting fires at the end of life. If you get cancer, we might give you chemotherapy to treat your cancer, but we ignore all the other changes that are happening at the same time. You've probably already got a bit of heart disease. You might have a bit of cognitive decline. And obviously, doctors aren't particularly interested, apart from a certain kind of doctors, in the wrinkles and the grey hair and the cosmetic stuff. So what's exciting is to intervene in a single process, or maybe a handful of processes that can have an impact on all of those things at once. And senescent cells are just a really great example. As we mentioned, senescent is just the scientific word for old. And these cells are effectively cells that are aged. They're cells that have been around in your body a long time, and for a variety of different reasons, they enter this senescent state. One thing that can happen is that they can divide too many times. So as you go through life, your body is constantly replenishing certain tissues. Things like your skin, the lining of your guts, they're constantly being replaced, basically because it's a rough and tumble environment to be a cell, one of those places. And so the simplest way that our bodies come up to deal with that is to just replace those cells on a fairly regular basis. And that means that the cells can divide too many times. And actually dividing too many times is a hallmark of cancer. So if you think about what a cancer is, it's a cell that's able to divide an infinite number of times and, form a tumor and eventually go on to, become serious enough to, cause a disease, maybe even kill you. So what your body does is it goes, well, that cell's divided a suspiciously large number of times. Maybe it's on the road to being cancerous. What I'll do is I'll stick on the brakes. I'll let it enter this senescent state and it will stop dividing. And what then happens is that the cell starts pumping out this cocktail of molecules. And these molecules exist primarily to call over the immune system. They say, hey, I've turned senescent. I'm not dividing anymore. I'm not doing my job as a cell. Can you come and gobble me up? And normally, in youth, when we're young, when we're healthy, the immune system will rush on over, gobble up that cell, and the problem is basically solved. But the problem is that as you get older, the number of ways that you can accumulate senescent cells increases because, for example, your cells are divided more times. Another way they can become senescent is because of damage to their DNA, the cellular instruction manual inside every single one of our cells. And again, that's a sort of indication the cell might be becoming cancerous. So these things all sort of happen more and more often as we get older. You've had more time for the cells to divide. You've had more time for the DNA in the cells to get damaged. Then on the other side of the balance, your immune system is getting weaker as well. And we've all, again, had this terrible reminder of that in the last year because of the coronavirus. We've seen that people who are older who catch COVID are at much greater risk of, serious disease, of death, in significant part because their immune system is less effective. And so you've got more senescent cells accumulating. You've got a weaker immune system clearing them up more slowly. And so that's why these things tend to accumulate as we get older. Now, that again might be quite a depressing or scary story, but for the fact that we've got these drugs, they're called senolytic drugs, that can kill the senescent cells and leave the rest of the cells in your body intact. And so scientists have done this experiment in mice where they'll give mice aged 24 months, so that's about 70 in human years, because obviously mice have a much shorter lifespan than we do. They'll give them these drugs and kill those senescent cells. And what they find is that the mice basically get biologically younger. So to explain what that means, they live a few months longer than mice that aren't given those drugs. And that's a good start. But you might be thinking, maybe they just sort of stumble along in geriatric ill health. They just found a way to sort of drag out the old period at the end of their life. That isn't what happens. Firstly, they push back a load of different diseases. They get less cancer, they get less heart disease, they get fewer cataracts. So that's exciting to start with. But they also seem to get less frail. They can run further and faster on a little mousy treadmill that they use in these experiments.
Wow.
It seems to stave off cognitive decline as well. So if you put a mouse that's been given these senolytics into a maze, an older mouse will tend to be less curious, maybe a bit more anxious in a new environment. But a mouse that's been given these senolytic drugs will zoom around and explore just like a younger mouse would. And honestly, these animals just look great. Now, you mentioned I'm a computational biologist. I don't deal with mice in the lab. But nonetheless, even to my untrained eye, these mice, they look fantastic. They've got better fur. They've got plumper skin. They just look like a younger mouse. And so these senescent cells appear to be drivers of a whole range of different aspects of the aging process. And so the challenge now, there are actually 20 or 30 companies trying to turn this from an idea that we can give to mice in the lab into something that we can give humans in the clinic. So I'm really excited about this as an idea because it's just so simple to explain. It's this accumulation of problematic cells that drive the aging process. And by getting rid of them, we can stave off a whole range of the problems of old age.
That is so exciting. And there are companies that are investigating this now. Is there another step between mice and humans, or what's the process of this development of this new drug?
When we start with a new medication, we often start with sort of baby steps. And so the dream is that, you're 50, you're 60, you've accumulated enough of these senescent cells that it's worth taking a senolytic drug and clearing them out and effectively staving off the aging process for some number of years, perhaps, if we're lucky. The issue is that before you start handing out drugs to people that we currently consider healthy, someone who's in their 50s, there's nothing wrong with them maybe. They might have a little bit of the very earliest stages of heart disease. They might be looking a bit wrinkly, but you don't want to be giving them a drug that's got loads of side effects. So I think the way this is going to play out is that these companies are targeting not the aging process as a whole at the moment, but they're targeting specific diseases where we know that senescent cells are a problem. So that's things like lung fibrosis or cataract or age-related macular degeneration. That's the disease I was trying to think of, which is a really common cause of blindness in older people. And what you can do is you can give senolytic treatments for these specific diseases. We hope that they work. And if those drugs are effective, i.e. they treat the disease, but most importantly, if they're safe, what we could then imagine doing is saying, okay, we've seen that these work in specific diseases. Let's try them in people who, maybe have a bit less wrong with them. Maybe they're at an earlier stage of the disease until eventually we can get to the point where it's safe. We're confident in giving these out to people who, there's nothing wrong with them apart from that they were born a long time ago.
You also have an approach to reducing the effects of aging called a portfolio approach with 4 different areas that you recommend for people to consider: remove, replace, repair, and reprogram. Can you talk about those 4, that portfolio approach?
This is a really important point because in the book, I talk about curing aging. And that's sounds like quite a bold idea, right?
It is a bold idea.
And I think that, the easiest misconception you can come away with from that is that I want to develop a pill and we're all just going to pop that pill, then we're going to stop growing old. But I really don't think that's what a cure for aging is going to look like. It is going to be this portfolio. And that's because we've got these 10 hallmarks. That might not even be a complete list. Science is still delving into the intricacies of the aging process. And it might be that even if it is a complete list, maybe there's something that would kill us aged 150, but we just don't live long enough to experience that hallmark yet. So we're going to constantly be on the lookout for these things, how they're changing. So in the book, I divide the treatments up into 4 different ideas. There's remove, and we've already talked about removing stuff. You can remove these senescent cells. I just think that's a very easy, clear example. There's some stuff that accumulates in our bodies as we get older. If we get rid of it, we can, ameliorate the aging process. Then there's the idea of replacing stuff because, there are certain parts of our body where we don't want to remove things without putting back a new, fresh alternative. I think a really good example of this is all the different flavors of stem cell therapy that you often hear talked about. So this is where cells in our body, particular populations, and perhaps because they're becoming senescent, perhaps even because we remove some of them with these senolytic drugs, we're not going to have stem cells to do things like replace our skin, replace our linings of our intestines, replace the blood cells that are constantly being renewed inside all of our bodies. And so we need to give people stem cells in order to replace those stem cells that are lost and allow them to carry on renewing these fast renewing tissues. So that's a really good example of that kind of therapy. Then in terms of repair, there are certain things you wouldn't want to rip out of people's body by removing them. You certainly wouldn't want to replace them either. And I think a really good example of this is something that people often ask me about, which is telomeres. These are protective caps on the end of our DNA. We wouldn't want to remove them because they're very, very important. We want to make sure that we've got these protective caps there. We wouldn't just want to replace them because what we really want to do is extend them back to how long they were in youth. And so the idea would be to go in and effectively add extra repeats onto these protective caps, make them longer, make the DNA in our cells more robust by adding these. We wouldn't want to remove or replace them. We'd want to repair them in situ. And finally, reprogram. This is the sort of most advanced idea in anti-aging therapy. And that's to go in and give our bodies new tools, basically. So, and perhaps this is partly because I view this stuff as a computational biologist, but we are essentially programmable machines. And the program is written in our DNA. So the idea is that we could go in and we could maybe alter that DNA, maybe optimize that DNA in certain ways to slow down the effects of the aging process. And I actually think a really cool example of this, though, it's going to be fascinating to see how this pans out over the next few years. It's an idea called cellular reprogramming. And this is where you put in 4 genes, how we do this at the moment. And these are 4 genes that are very commonly expressed in stem cells at the very earliest stage of human development. So if you look at what are called embryonic stem cells, so stem cells that are right at the very start, just after an egg and a sperm have met and the sort of fertilized egg starts dividing, you get these embryonic stem cells. And what you can do is you can put these 4 genes into a normal adult cell. So, you could take a cell from my skin or a cell from somewhere else in the body of anybody, basically. And you can give it these 4 genes and you can turn back the clock and turn it into an embryonic stem cell. Now, people are very excited about this because we can use it for stem cell therapy. We can develop new cells to replace those that have been lost. But the other thing that's really exciting is that if we don't turn a cell all the way back to being a stem cell, we seem to be able to reverse the biological clock in those cells. We seem to be able to effectively turn back time. And, this is just starting to be done in whole animals. But what's really exciting is it's literally this idea of reprogramming. It's taking tools that already exist in our biology and turning back the clock inside those cells and effectively making them younger. So that's why there's this sort of multi-pronged approach. It's not going to be a single pill. We're going to be hopefully, removing our senescent cells. Maybe we'll be using stem cells to top up some of those cells that we've got rid of. We'll be repairing our telomeres. And maybe in the longer term, we'll be editing our genes in order to try and, stay on top of aging in a whole variety of ways.
How likely is any one of these 4 different portfolio approaches? And with all of the scientific studies that you're doing and that people are doing around the world, what do you think is closest to becoming a reality to the larger population? Which one of these areas?
As a scientist, I'm always terrible, and journalists hate me because I'll never give a hard timescale. I won't say, in 2.7 years this is going to be developed, and this is going to be we're all going to live 3 months longer as a result of this development. However, I'm genuinely excited, and the way that I sort of hedge my bets and remain exciting while not sort of tarnishing my credibility is to say that I think a lot of this stuff is going to happen in time for people who are alive today. And the reason I'm excited about that is, well, let's think about those senolytic drugs. They might sound complicated and cutting edge, but actually they're already in clinical trials. The first clinical trial started in 2018. I've already mentioned there are 20 or 30 companies trying to do this. This could well be in the clinic in the next 5 years. And if, as I said earlier, if they're effective, if they're safe at the current applications, it might only be another 5 or 10 years after that before we're starting to use them as a general anti-aging pill. So I guess, we'll just have to wait and see. Then there's some other stuff that could happen on a similarly, maybe even a quicker near-term timeline. And that's the idea of repurposing existing drugs. And a really good example of this is a drug called metformin, which is a diabetes drug. But scientists have noticed that diabetics taking metformin can actually live longer than people who aren't diabetic, who aren't taking it in the same trials. And the reason those people are included in the trials is basically to act as a control to see what's going on. But that's really fascinating because someone who isn't diabetic is probably healthier than a diabetic taking metformin. They're probably not as overweight. They probably suffer from less other things like cardiovascular disease that might potentially kill them. And yet, as we've observed, people taking metformin, even if they're already diabetic, I mean, that's why they're taking the metformin, it's a diabetes drug, seem to live longer. And there's some evidence that it's partly because of its anti-cancer properties. There's also some evidence in animals that it can make things like mice live longer. And so what we really, really need, rather than these what are called observational studies where we just watch people, is a proper randomized controlled trial where we get a bunch of people over the age of, say, 60, give half of them metformin, half of them what's called a placebo, basically a sugar pill that doesn't do anything. And we just see who lives longer, see who gets the fewest diseases. And that's a trial I was going to say on the drawing board. It should already have started. It's been delayed due to COVID. There's a trial called TAME in the US, which is targeting aging with metformin. And if that works, metformin is something it's off patent. It costs cents per pill. This is something that we could basically roll out immediately if we can get the results to show that it works. And there are a couple of other examples of existing drugs. There's one called rapamycin, again, that potentially we could repurpose, and that could be available in the very short term. And when you start talking about stem cells and gene therapy, these things sound like they might be a long way away. But I think they're decades away rather than centuries because, we've already got some stem cell and gene therapies in the clinic now, and we're getting better and better at doing these things. And then you've got to remember, if you can live long enough effectively, and then you can benefit from these early senolytics, you can benefit from metformin if that works, or some of these other repurposed drugs, you might add an extra few years to your life. And that gives scientists another few years to develop these more advanced therapies. So I really do think, it's very hard to say how long people alive today are going to live, but it's a very exciting time because, if you're alive now and you're relatively healthy, you can carry on benefiting from all these advancements and live, further into the future, buying scientists more time and so on. So as I say, it's a very exciting time to be alive and, be keeping an eye on all these different therapies that are in development.
And you're not the only one looking at graphs. So we all know that the world is aging and more people are aging and they're living longer. So I have to believe that there are more scientific companies and more scientists all jumping on this trend and trying to understand how do we slow down or cease aging? How do we fix aging? This is something that is affecting hundreds of people. So I would think there's more people paying attention to this than before. And when you think about it, a decade ago, or more than that, getting a new knee or a new hip would be inconceivable. And now it's a par for the course. So this kind of development seems shocking to us now, but in a few years, it may not be.
I absolutely agree. Actually, in the book, I give the example. You think about this idea of, developing treatments, and the longer that you live, the longer you can continue to live and so on. And that might sound like a bit of a sort of sci-fi crazy idea of sort of gradually living longer and longer and longer. But actually, this is something that we observe around us all the time. If you think about someone who was born in the 1930s or the 1940s, they might have survived their childhood because of developments in things like vaccinations and, maybe the first antibiotics, or at least improvements in hygiene and stuff like that. And because they survived that extra bit of time, that meant that they were then able to, become an adult, live through their adult life. And all this time, things like heart disease medication and cancer medication were being developed. So when they themselves became old in the 1980s or 1990s or the 2000s, the reason that they were able to live even longer still is because they benefited from all those decades of intervening medical advances. So I think exactly as you say, this stuff can sound sort of sci-fi and maybe even a bit wacky now, but I think in a few decades' time, it's going to be, as routine as going to the dentist.
So is there anything about your research that is surprising to you? You've examined this, you've decided that there's a portfolio approach makes sense, but is there anything that has surprised or has been unexpected for you?
I think the most surprising and exciting thing about this actually isn't any one specific development. It's just the sheer number of different ways there are to intervene in aging. So I mentioned, we got these 10 hallmarks. I divide them into these 4 chapters, which sort of look at the different approaches that we could take. But actually, we've just got dozens of different ways now that we can slow down or reverse the aging of animals in the lab. And these are everything from changing what they eat, to giving them drugs, to altering their genes, to stem cell therapies, there are just so many different approaches. And the reason that's exciting is for 2 reasons. Firstly, because as I say, I think the treatments for aging are going to be a portfolio approach. So this is what we need in order to succeed at doing something about aging. But secondly, because it's not like we've got all our eggs in one basket. It's not as though there's one single dream pill that we're just crossing everything is going to come off. Because maybe senolytics won't work out, but it might be that metformin turns out to be incredibly effective. Or maybe something else won't work, but stem cells will, there'll be some stem cell treatment or some gene therapy that we just are thinking about and developing now. So there are just so many different bets that we have. It'll be phenomenally unlucky for all of these different ideas, to come up with nothing. And it just shows you as well that the aging process is so interconnected. I mentioned telomeres. They're intimately connected with cellular senescence, because it's actually how, as your telomeres get shorter, is what causes cells to become senescent, is one of the things that does cause it. And that means that maybe by intervening in senescence, that will improve our telomeres, or maybe by intervening in telomeres, that will improve our senescence. So we've just got so many different bets, so many different ways these things are interrelated, that I just think would be phenomenally unlucky for none of it to work at all.
That's exciting, to place multiple bets just to see what will happen. And the fact that you're approaching it in a number of different ways is really encouraging. In this show, I always ask my guests, what can our listeners do to put what they're learning into practice? You've already anticipated this and dedicated an entire chapter in your book, Ageless, to specific things that people can do right now to live longer. So your advice is echoed by most other people, which is don't smoke, don't eat too much, get exercise, get 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, get vaccinated, wash your hands, take care of your teeth, wear sunscreen, monitor your heart and blood pressure, skip supplements, and my favorite, be a woman. Of all of this advice, in your experience, what do people tend to ignore?
I think a lot of people ignore a lot of it, to be honest. And I think maybe ignore is the wrong word, because sometimes it's just our lives. They're so busy these days. I think, particularly if you're not as wealthy, you don't have as many options in terms of what you eat and how much free time you have to do exercise. It's just so important to try and integrate this stuff into your daily routine. For example, back when I worked in the office, cycle to work. And it's just so fantastic to, force yourself every day. You have to cycle for 20 or 30 minutes. Otherwise, you won't be in the office. You won't be at your job. So I think it's really, really difficult sometimes to fit all these things in. And it's just really important to try and integrate them. In terms of specific things people often forget or miss out on, and this is actually one that I neglected, I think, before I started doing the research of this book. Everyone knows that it's really important to exercise. There's this sort of joke that doctors have that if exercise were a pill, everyone would be queuing up to take it. But it's just the fact that, it does require a little bit more effort that makes it more difficult. I think a really neglected aspect of exercise is strength training. So I think a lot of us, when we imagine exercise, we imagine going for a run or, getting on the spinning machine down at the gym. But actually, strength training is really, really important, because every decade after the age of about 30, you lose, I think it's about 10% of your muscle mass and a similar amount of muscle strength. And that's something that, it is part of the aging process, but it's in significant part reversible. Just if you make sure those muscles are being used, if you make sure they're engaged, your muscles can regenerate to a significant degree. And the thing that really convinced me about this was I found a study looking at people in their 90s, and they gave them a 2-month-long course of strength training. And they found that their strength increased significantly. They could walk further and faster. It just had, these wide-ranging effects on their physiology. And you just think if someone in their 90s can do this, then, it's accessible to all of us. It's never too late to start. And I really think that's a great piece of sort of something to have in mind with all of these bits of health advice, because the aging process is cumulative. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now, because however old you are, it's never too late to start on, slapping on the sun cream and try and reduce the sort of continuing accumulation of DNA damage. Even if you've accumulated a lot of damage already, it could be that bit of sun cream that you slap on one day is the thing that prevents a particular mutation which causes you to get skin cancer. Whatever it is, all of these things are cumulative.
That's absolutely true. I worked with a woman at Tufts University ages ago, Mim Nelson, who did a program called Strong Women, Strong Bones. And she was targeting women over 60 who had never been to a gym, who said, I am not one of those muscle heads that's going to go in and grunt and sweat and lift weights, and had them lifting weights and increased their bone density in a matter of weeks. So the fact that we can do this, and I love that it isn't too late. It doesn't matter how old you are. You can start now. You can start today. Of all of those things, are there 1 or 2 or 3 things you would say that is more important if our listeners are getting excited and getting motivated just listening to you? What would you highlight for them to start with?
The single most important, and the reason I put this as number 1 in the chapter, it's really obvious, but if you are smoking and you're hoping to live a long, healthy life, you have to stop. And I know this is something that everybody bangs on about all the time, but when you just look at the statistics, smoking shaves about 10 years off your life expectancy. That's an enormous amount of time. Imagine what you can achieve in 10 years. And I think a lot of people who smoke think, oh, this isn't a problem because I'll just lose those horrible 10 years at the end. I'll just, subtract those 10 years in a nursing home. But that isn't what happens. Smokers actually lose about 10 years of healthy life as well. So it's the whole of their aging is accelerated, and that sort of that end part of life is advanced. And they effectively die in exactly the same unpleasant ways, but 10 years earlier, and obviously with the added risk of things like lung cancer. So my number one tip, and as I say, I know this is obvious, but it's just really worth ramming home, is do not smoke. And I think actually in terms of the other biggest intervention you can make, it's another one that's relatively obvious, but it's about diet. You can do so much to your life expectancy and your health expectancy just by trying to not eat too much, eat a variety of different things. I think that highly prescriptive dietary advice is often misguided because, there are these people who talk about superfoods or, which berry is in this week as the magic thing that's going to radically improve your health in a particular way. I think the problem with diet is it's just so complicated and so multivariate, by which I mean, we can change how much we eat, we can change when we eat it. Even at the most basic level, there's protein and there's fat and there's carbohydrate, and you've got to, alter the ratio of those three things. You'll hear people going on about every particular permutation of diet. But I think the best advice is just eat not too much and a huge variety of different things. And the other thing I'd sort of tempt people towards, if they can be tempted, is towards trying to integrate a few more vegetables into their diet and a bit less meat. Because I think, although, again, the evidence isn't conclusive because diet is just so complicated, there are some really good reasons to think that eating a few more vegetables are going to improve your diet. They can improve your microbiome, which are the sort of bacteria and fungi that are found in your guts, and that can help you digest things better and just help your health in general. And there's also some evidence that by eating plant protein rather than meat protein, that can actually improve your lifespan and health span as well. So it's not absolutely, open and shut. It's difficult to do these studies because, vegetarians are systematically different to people who eat meat in other ways. They can, they might be more health conscious. They might do more exercise. But I think there are some really good scientific underlying reasons to try and cut back your meat consumption if you want to live a long time.
That's great advice. I was surprised when I was reading this book that the actual study of aging itself is not widely supported by the policy field. In fact, it's dismissed kind of as a novelty versus a reality. What do you think the barriers are to this, and what can our listeners do to encourage more funding and support of this branch of research?
This actually leads on very well from the last question because when I'm asked for health advice, I quite often say the single best piece of health advice you can give is to campaign for more funding for aging research. And that might sound like a weird piece of health advice. It's not about smoking or exercise or diet or whatever else. But the fact is, I think for most people, the single biggest determinant of how long and how healthily you live is going to be how much money we put into aging biology, and how obviously, you've got to have a bit of luck. It's how much luck we have in terms of which treatments turn out to work and how quickly we can roll those things out. Because as you say, it's just shocking how little we invest in this. Right at the top of our chat, I made this allusion that 2/3 of people, in fact, more than 2/3 of people around the world die effectively because of aging. But actually in wealthy countries like the US, like the countries in Europe, like the UK where I live, it's more like 90% of people are killed by the diseases of aging. And so there's this phenomenal amount of healthcare spending. So if you look at the US, I think about $4 trillion a year, that's 4 with 12 zeros after it dollars a year, is spent on healthcare. And a huge fraction of that is on the chronic diseases of old age, things like diabetes and heart disease and cancer that you suffer with for such a long time. You need so much healthcare, you need so much social care, really, really expensive diseases. And yet, if you look at how much we spend on aging biology, on trying to understand the process of aging that gives rise to all these diseases, well, actually, the US is in a way quite lucky because the US has this institute called the National Institute of Aging, the NIA, which is a government institute that specifically exists to hand out money for aging research. And that's got a budget of $3.5 billion. Now, remember, that's billion, not trillion. So it's already 1,000 times less than the funding for healthcare. But actually, there's another joke in the biogerontology field, which is that the NIA doesn't stand for National Institute on Aging, but for National Institute on Alzheimer's disease. The reason being that of that $3.5 billion, over $2 billion goes to what's called the neuroscience division. So that's the division looking basically at dementia. And actually, the section that looks on aging biology gets about $350 million of funding every year. Now, if you think about it, that's only just over $1 per American. And yet, this is looking at something that causes about 85% of your deaths in the US. So it's this incredible mismatch between the seriousness of the problem and the amount of money spent researching it. And actually, I think it's even worse than this terrible statistic suggests, because the Division of Aging Biology in the NIA It's primarily interested in understanding the aging process, not developing treatments for it. Now, this isn't a bad thing. We need to understand something before we can develop treatments, but we also need to have much, much more money put into what's called the translational side of this science, trying to turn it from something that happens in mice to something we can actually use in human beings. So basically, I want people to campaign about this. I want them to write to their representatives, call up their congressperson or their senator. This might sound like a crazy thing to go on about, but I just think it's so, so important. I think that, it's the single biggest cause of human suffering is what I contend in the book, because it causes so many deaths, and those deaths are, caused in such unpleasant ways. It's not just about the dying. It's about the frailty. It's about the incontinence. It's about the cognitive decline that means you can't be independent anymore. So it's just such a huge deal. And yet we spend so little money on it. So, I really, really want to spread the word about this. That's why I wrote this book. I want people to be chatting about it, in pubs and bars and at dinner parties as soon as that's safe again, which hopefully won't be too long. I want policymakers to be talking about it for all the reasons that I've just sort of discussed. But I also want to highlight it for scientists and doctors. And that's because during my career as a computational biologist, I found that often, even though I was new to the field, I was trained in physics, I would know more about aging biology than my colleagues. And this isn't because I'm some kind of genius who, swooped in knowing everything and was able to teach them, how it's done. It's just because I'd done a bit of reading about aging biology. And, I'd meet people who had fantastic degrees from top universities. I'd start talking to them, and they hadn't had a single lecture on the biology of aging. My wife's a doctor, and she has, they barely touch on it in your medical training. They tell you, how to manage patients who are taking lots and lots of different drugs, which is a really common problem with aging. They tell you about the sort of social care issues that might surround it, but they don't ever tell you about the fact that the aging process is responsible for all this stuff. When she first met me and I told her about this kind of thing, I think she thought I was a bit crazy. But actually, as she's gone through her medical practice, she's rotated through loads and loads of different medical specialties. What you find is that most of the patients you see, whatever ward you're on, are going to be patients who are older, they're taking multiple different drugs, they've got multiple different conditions. And that's why, she now firmly believes, along with me, thankfully she married me, obviously, so she must have forgiven me in the end.
Yes, you didn't think you were crazy. You convinced one person anyway.
Convinced one person, one down.
Yeah.
This is such an important issue. I really want everybody to be talking about it. And that's, the whole gamut of different people. So that's why I wrote the book. And yeah, I think that's why that's my favorite bit of health advice, is to get the word out about aging biology.
What we will do in the show notes is to have not just a link to Dr. Steele's book, Ageless, but also recommendations as to how you can write and who you should write to the NIA to get more funding on the actual study of aging, the progress of aging and how we solve that, as opposed to the diseases of aging, which I think is what is more typically funded.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, I've campaigned about science funding as well. This is one of my subjects that I tend to bang on about. And actually, I think the diseases of aging are underfunded as well. But what's remarkable is that the aging process itself is even more underfunded than the research into those diseases is. So it's just, we need more funding of science generally. We've seen over the last sort of year or so how powerful the scientific process is at being able to, come up with treatments, solve problems. And I think aging is just one particularly neglected facet of something that overall we need to pay much more attention to as a society.
And it goes back to the beginning of our conversation where you're talking about how you studied this in worms and rats, and there's a whole process before it can be determined if it's safe and effective for humans. So that's important. And we are all aging all the time. But the idea that with aging, we can reduce some of the indignities and reduce the chance of the diseases that come along with aging at a very cellular level is tremendously exciting.
It really is. And so that's how I went from as I said, changing career because of a graft to just having this enormous passion to deal with this problem, because it is about dignity at the end of the day, isn't it? We want everyone to have as dignified and as healthy a life as possible. And that's what really excites me.
It's been wonderful having a chance to talk to you this morning, Dr. Steele. Your enthusiasm is infectious, and I hope everyone reads this book and petitions for more funding and more science funding. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's our show for today. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends about it so we can grow our tribe. Visit our website, seniorityauthority.org, to submit questions for future shows, to find out details from Dr. Steele's book, and to watch archived episodes. Give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform and visit us on social media. Until next time, enjoy the chance to get smarter about growing older. thanks to our show sponsor, the Riverwoods Group, Northern New England's largest family of nonprofit retirement communities, where active adults find community, purpose, and peace of mind. Visit riverwoodsgroup.org. That's our show for today. Did it spark a question? If so, send us your questions at seniorityauthority.org and we'll track down the answer. Meanwhile, don't forget to subscribe, like us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, let's get smarter about growing older.